Fire, ash, silence. On Palm Sunday 1826, a city of ghosts decided to die, not by sword, not by starvation, but by their own hand. Picture this: 10,000 skeletons walking into the guns of 30,000 well-fed soldiers. They called it the Exodus. It wasn't a battle, it was a funeral procession that fought back. By the end of this video, you'll see how a single explosion in a mud brick town didn't just kill the defenders, it woke up the entire world. Missolonghi fell so Greece could rise. But first, they had to pay the ultimate price in blood. To understand how a graveyard became a symbol of freedom, we must first understand the terror that was strangling the Greek Revolution. By 1825, the dream of independence was dying. It wasn't dying a hero's death, it was rotting. Civil wars had drained the treasury. European powers looked on with indifference. The Ottoman Empire, tired of the rebellion, had played its trump card. The Sultan called upon his most powerful vassal, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, to finish what the Turks could not. The Sultan didn't just ask for soldiers. He asked for an executioner. Enter Ibrahim Pasha. If the Ottoman commanders were old-school medieval warlords, Ibrahim was the future. Cold, calculated, European. His army had been trained by French veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. They didn't charge in disorganized mobs, screaming religious slogans. They marched in step. They wore uniforms. They used the bayonet with mathematical precision. This wasn't a horde. This was a machine. Consider the contrast. The Ottoman forces had spent 4 years failing to crush the Greeks because they fought the same way the Greeks did: guerrilla skirmishes, mountain ambushes, chaotic melees. Ibrahim brought the discipline of the West to the brutality of the East. He landed in the Peloponnese and simply erased opposition. He burned olive groves. He enslaved villages. He turned the Garden of Greece into a desert. His strategy was brutally simple. If you cannot catch the fish, drain the water. By late 1825, this unstoppable force turned its eyes north, to the one city that had defied the Sultan for years: Missolonghi. On a map, Missolonghi makes no sense as a fortress. It isn't built on a crag like Corinth. It isn't surrounded by massive stone walls like Rhodes. It is a fishing town sitting flat on a muddy lagoon. It barely rises above sea level. From a distance, it looks like a collection of shacks sinking into the swamp. Military logic said it should have fallen in a day. The walls were often nothing more than dried mud and earthen ramparts, barely high enough to stop a determined horse. The moat was a shallow ditch filled with stagnant water. A concerted artillery barrage should have turned the entire settlement into dust. A single heavy cavalry charge should have ridden over the earthworks. But the lagoon was the city's shield and its secret. The waters around Missolonghi are a treacherous maze of shallows, silt banks, and islets. Deep-draft Ottoman warships couldn't get close enough to bombard the town effectively. They would run aground miles out. Only small, flat-bottomed boats could navigate the labyrinth. This meant that any assault had to be amphibious, slow, and exposed. Inside this mud fence stood the free besieged, a collection of locals, refugees, and the remnants of the Suliotes, the legendary mountain warriors of Epirus. These men were living anachronisms. While Ibrahim's army was practicing formation drills, the Suliotes were cleaning their yataghans and singing songs about Alexander the Great. They wore the fustanella, the pleated kilt, and fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. They had no artillery corps. They had no supply lines. They had no uniforms. What they had was a complete, terrifying lack of fear. The strategic situation in early 1826 was a nightmare. Reshid Pasha, the Ottoman commander known as Qutahist, had been banging his head against Missolonghi's mud walls for months with little success. His army was demoralized, unpaid, and suffering from the swamp fever that plagued the lagoon. The defenders had mocked him from the walls. They had raided his camps. They had turned the siege into a stalemate. Then Ibrahim arrived. The arrival of the Egyptian fleet changed the physics of the war. 135 ships darkened the horizon. Transport vessels disgorged regiment after regiment of fresh, disciplined infantry, Arab lancers, French-trained artillerymen, Mameluke cavalry. The combined force facing the town swelled to over 30,000 men. Inside the walls, barely 4,000 exhausted fighters and 10,000 women, children, and elderly. The odds were 7-1. The outcome seemed mathematically inevitable. Ibrahim rode out to meet Reshid Pasha. The meeting was tense. The Egyptian commander looked at the ragged Ottoman siege lines, then looked at the pathetic mud fence of the city. He laughed. He reportedly told Reshid that he wouldn't need months. He would take the fence in 14 days. He was wrong. The siege began not with an assault, but with engineering. Ibrahim's French advisors laid out a grid of trenches. They approached the walls with the slow, inexorable creep of a glacier. Zigzag patterns to deflect return fire, parallel ditches, battery positions. They were bringing the science of the siege to a knife fight. The first bombardments were apocalyptic. Thousands of shells rained down on the thatched roofs of Missolonghi. The city burned. Smoke hung low over the lagoon, mixing with the morning mist. The defenders dove into cellars or huddled behind the earthworks. But when the shelling stopped and the Egyptian infantry advanced, they found the Greeks waiting. This is where the difference between parade ground drills and swamp warfare became bloody apparent. Ibrahim sent his Arab regulars forward in tight columns. They marched into the kill zone with perfect discipline, but the mud of the lagoon neutralized their speed. The uneven ground broke their formations, and from behind the earthworks, the Greek fire was withering. The Suliotes didn't fire in volleys. They fired at will, every shot aimed by a marksman who had learned to shoot hunting mountain goats. They targeted officers. They targeted standard-bearers. The Egyptian columns wavered. Then, the Greeks did the unthinkable. They didn't just hold the line, they jumped over the wall. Yataghans drawn, pistol in one hand, dagger in the other, the defenders charged into the muddy no-man's land. The psychological impact was devastating. Ibrahim's soldiers were trained to fight other soldiers, not demons who sprinted through artillery fire to engage in hand-to-hand combat. The modern bayonet is a clumsy weapon in a mud pit. The short Greek swords were efficient butchers. In those early weeks, the lagoon turned red. Ibrahim's 14-day promise evaporated in the smoke of the cannons. He threw wave after wave at the walls. He tried night attacks. He tried mining the walls. Every time, the result was the same. The fence held. The defenders began to believe they were invincible. They mocked Ibrahim from the ramparts, just as they had mocked Reshid. They called him the Arab, the Arab, daring him to come closer. They felt the eyes of Europe on them. Lord Byron had died in this very town just 2 years prior, cementing Missolonghi as the romantic heart of the Greek cause. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for an idea. But Ibrahim was not a man to be baited by insults. He was a mathematician of death. He realized that brute force was expensive. He was losing hundreds of unmatched soldiers for every dozen Greeks he killed. The exchange rate was poor, so he stopped. The guns fell silent. The charges ceased. The Egyptian army pulled back, just out of musket range. Ibrahim looked at the lagoon. He looked at the supply boats sneaking in from the Ionian Islands under the cover of darkness, bringing bread and gunpowder to the defenders. He realized his mistake. He had been trying to break the wall. He needed to break the stomach. The order went out. No more charges, no more glory. The fleet moved to block the sea lanes. The engineers were put to work sealing the channels. The strategy shifted from assault to suffocation. The anvil was in place. Now, Ibrahim would slowly, patiently lower the hammer. The city of Missolonghi was about to learn that hunger is a slower, crueler weapon than the sword. The battles of February had been a test of courage. The coming months would be a test of biology. The heroics of the sword were over. The horror of the empty belly was about to begin. The war for the city became a war for the water. Ibrahim knew that as long as the lagoon remained open, Missolonghi would never fall. The town wasn't an island, but it breathed through the sea. Small Greek boats, maneuvering through the silt channels like water striders, brought ammunition from the Ionian Islands and food from the Peloponnese. They were the umbilical cord keeping the rebellion alive. To strangle the city, Ibrahim had to sever the cord. The geography of the lagoon was defined by a chain of tiny islets, mud banks, barely rising above the waves, fortified with primitive earthworks and wooden palisades. These were the gatekeepers, Vasiladi, Dolmus, Kleisova. If Ibrahim took these, he controlled the flow of food. He started with Vasiladi. It wasn't a fortress. It was a glorified mound of dirt, housing a few dozen defenders and some rusted cannons. But it commanded the main channel. On February 25th, the Egyptian machine went to work. A massive bombardment pulverized the earthworks. Then, a swarm of flat-bottomed assault boats, specially built for the shallows, overwhelmed the stunned survivors. Vasiladi fell. The first knot in the noose was tied. Next came Dolmas. The fighting was savage, hand-to-hand in knee-deep water. The Greeks fought until their ammunition ran dry, then fought with stones and gunstocks. But the weight of numbers was mathematical and absolute. Dolmas fell. The defenders inside Missolonghi watched the smoke rise from the lagoon. They saw their outer defences crumbling one by one. The umbilical cord was being squeezed, but there was one islet left. The most important one, Kleisova. If Missolonghi was the heart of the resistance, Kleisova was the fist. It was defended by 130 men, not soldiers. 130 ragged, starving, exhausted men led by Kitsos Tsavalas, a Suliote warlord who treated warfare like a personal vendetta. They had a primitive rampart and the mud beneath their feet. Against them, Ibrahim sent everything. He was frustrated. The siege was dragging on. He wanted to crush this last annoyance and march into the city. On March 25th, the anniversary of the revolution's outbreak, he launched a combined assault. It was overkill. It was hubris. It was a massacre, but not the one he expected. Picture the scene. The waters around Kleisova are shallow, a treacherous mix of mud and silt. Ibrahim's boats ran aground hundreds of yards from the islet. His soldiers, the elite of the Egyptian army, had to jump into the water. They were carrying muskets, ammunition, and bayonets. The water was waist-deep. The mud sucked at their boots. They were slow, exposed, and helpless. From the ramparts of Kleisova, the 130 defenders didn't panic. They waited, until they could see the whites of the Egyptians' eyes. They waited until they could hear the officers shouting orders. Then, they opened fire. It wasn't a battle. It was a turkey shoot. The Egyptians couldn't run. The water was too deep. They couldn't duck. There was no cover. They couldn't charge. The mud held them fast. They simply died. Wave after wave of attackers waded into the red lagoon. Bodies began to pile up in the water, creating gruesome floating barricades that the next wave had to push aside. The water turned a thick, opaque crimson. Ibrahim, watching from his flagship, flew into a rage. This defied all military logic. How could 130 men stop an army? He ordered his officers to lead the charge personally. They died. He ordered a diversionary attack on the city itself to draw fire away. It failed. Finally, in a fit of desperation, Ibrahim himself jumped into a boat to rally his men. He got close enough to the fighting to feel the heat. A Greek bullet found his leg. The conqueror of the Morea, the man who had terrified the Ottoman Empire, was wounded by a peasant on a mud bank. By sunset, the guns fell silent. The toll was catastrophic. Historical estimates vary, but the numbers are insane. Over 2,500 Ottoman and Egyptian soldiers lay dead or wounded in the lagoon. The defenders of Kleisova? They lost roughly 35 men. It was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. A tactical miracle. Inside Missolonghi, the church bells rang. They sang songs of victory. For a brief, shining moment, they believed they had won. They thought Ibrahim was broken, but they were wrong. Ibrahim wasn't broken. He was just done playing games. The Battle of Kleisova proved that he couldn't take the city by force without bleeding his army dry. The cost was too high. So, he returned to his original plan. If he couldn't kill them with lead, he would kill them with emptiness. The victory at Kleisova, paradoxically, sealed Missolonghi's fate. It forced Ibrahim to fully commit to the blockade. He brought in a fleet of new, smaller gunboats that could navigate the shallows completely. He linked them together with chains and floating booms. He patrolled the waters 24 hours a day. By the first week of April, the seal was airtight. Not a single boat could get in, not a sack of flour, not a grain of wheat. The umbilical cord was cut. Inside the walls, the heroics of Kleisova faded into the grim reality of biology. The city had been under siege for a year. The stockpiles were long gone. The cats and dogs had disappeared months ago. Now, the famine began in earnest. It started with the donkeys and the horses. These were prized animals, essential for work, but hunger has no economy. They were slaughtered and boiled. Then came the mules. When the livestock was gone, the diet turned to the grotesque. We have diaries from the survivors. They read like a descent into madness. They boiled leather shoes to soften the hide and drank the broth. They ate the oil-soaked rags used to clean rifles. They scavenged the lagoon for seaweed, boiling the salty kelp until it was a grey slime. They hunted mice and rats with the same intensity they hunted Turks. Scurvy swept through the population like a plague. Gums bled. Teeth fell out. Old wounds reopened. Men who could sprint up a mountain in full armor a month ago now needed a walking stick to cross the town square. But here is where it gets insane. They didn't surrender. Ibrahim knew they were starving. He sent envoys to the walls. He didn't offer death. He offered mercy. He offered food. "Surrender," the messengers shouted. "The Pasha admires your courage. He will let you live. He will let you leave. Just open the gates." Imagine the temptation, the smell of roasting meat wafting from the Ottoman lines, the cries of your own children, their bellies distended from starvation, begging for bread. All you have to do is open a wooden gate, and the pain stops. The answer from the walls was silence, or a single gunshot. The defenders had entered a psychological state that transcended logic. They called it the Brotherhood of Hunger. Suffering became a badge of honor. To eat was to be weak. To starve was to be free. They held councils where skeletal commanders debated strategy while chewing on boiled leather straps. The civilian population suffered the most. Mothers stopped producing milk. Infants died in silence, their energy too depleted even to cry. The graveyards were full, so they buried the dead in backyards, in cellars, in the streets. The smell of the city changed. It wasn't just gunpowder and mud anymore. It was the sweet, sickly scent of slow death. By mid-April, the situation was terminal. The Swiss newspaper editor Johann Jakob Meyer, who was inside the city publishing a chronicle of the siege, wrote his final dispatch. It is one of the most haunting letters in history. "We are reduced to the most dire extremity," he wrote. "We are eating the most unclean things. We are suffering from hunger, thirst, and disease. But in the name of God, we remain firm. We will die free." Meyer knew he was writing his own obituary. He wasn't asking for help. He knew help wasn't coming. He was documenting a crime scene. The leadership of the city, the Bishop Rogon, Joseph, the warlords, Notis Botzaris, and Kitsos Tsavalas, gathered for a final council. They looked at their men. The warriors were ghosts. Their eyes were sunken, their skin paper-thin. They couldn't lift their heavy muskets anymore. They were leaning against the walls, watching the Egyptian campfires, waiting for the end. A decision had to be made. They could stay. If they stayed, they would die of starvation within a week. They would be too weak to fight when Ibrahim finally climbed the walls. They would be slaughtered in their beds like sheep. Or they could surrender. They could open the gates and trust the word of a man who had burned half of Greece. They could live as slaves. Or they could do the impossible. Whispers began to circulate through the starving town. A plan so desperate, so suicidal, that only men who had already accepted death could conceive it. They wouldn't wait for Ibrahim to come to them. They wouldn't wait to die in the mud. They would walk out. All of them. The men, the women, the children, the wounded, the entire population of Missolonghi would open the gates, march across the plain, and cut a road through 30,000 enemy soldiers to the mountains beyond. It was madness. It was suicide. It was the only choice left. The date was set for the night of April 10th, Palm Sunday. The irony was not lost on them. The day of Christ's entry into Jerusalem would be the day of their exit into eternity. Inside the walls, the preparations began in silence. Women tore up their remaining clothes to make bandages. Men sharpened their yatagans for the last time. Those too sick or wounded to walk were moved to the stone houses near the powder magazines. They knew they couldn't make the journey. They were being prepared for a different role. The city held its breath. The hunger was forgotten. The pain was forgotten. There was only the terrifying clarity of the end. The anvil of the blockade had done its work. The hammer of the assault was poised. But the metal between them was about to shatter in a way the world had never seen. The sun set on Palm Sunday, the 10th of April, 1826. It was a sunset the color of a bruise, dark purple and angry red. Inside the walls of Missolonghi, the silence was heavier than the artillery fire that had pounded them for a year. The decision had been made. The orders had been whispered. The exodus was not a retreat. It was an assault. The plan was a masterpiece of desperation. The survivors were divided into 3 columns. The first 2 were the spearheads fighting men, the remnants of the garrisons, the hardest of the Suliotes. Their job was to punch a hole through the Ottoman siege lines. They would act as human battering rams. The third column was the soul of the city. In the center walked the women, the children, the elderly who could still move, and the few civilians who hadn't died of starvation. They were placed in the middle of a protective square of soldiers. But what about those who couldn't walk? This is the darkest chapter of the night. There were hundreds of wounded, sick, and crippled, lying in the ruins of the houses. They couldn't move. They knew they would be left behind. The scenes of parting were biblical in their tragedy. Fathers kissing dying sons goodbye. Wives choosing to stay with wounded husbands rather than save themselves. The leadership made a grim calculation. To leave the sick to the mercy of the Turks was a death sentence, likely involving torture. So, they concentrated the immovable in the strongest stone houses and the powder magazines. They gave them loaded muskets and a torch. Their orders were simple. Wait for the enemy to enter. Then, send them to hell. Christos Kapsalis, a venerable elder of the city, took command of the largest magazine. He was a man of peace who prepared for an act of supreme violence. He gathered the sick, the women who refused to leave, and the old men. They sat on kegs of gunpowder. They began to sing funeral dirges while they were still alive. At 7 p.m., a hush fell over the town. The bishop, Rogon Joseph, performed the final rites. There was no bread for communion, so he blessed them with his tears. The gates were unbarred. The bridges, makeshift structures of wood and debris, were lowered silently over the moat. The plan relied on one thing: surprise. They needed to cross the open plain, reach the enemy trenches, and break through before the Ottoman machine could wake up. But the universe has a cruel sense of humor. History tells us that a deserter, a Bulgarian mercenary who had been fighting for the Greeks, slipped out of the city hours before the exodus. He went straight to Ibrahim's tent. He told him everything: the time, the route, the plan. Ibrahim didn't panic. He smiled. He didn't attack the city. He simply moved his pieces on the chessboard. He reinforced the exact sector where the Greeks planned to strike. He positioned his artillery to create a kill zone. He placed his cavalry on the flanks, hidden in the darkness, waiting for the signal. The trap was set. The mouse was walking willingly into the jaws of the cat. At 8 p.m., the first column moved out. They moved like ghosts, their feet wrapped in rags to stifle the sound. The moon was obscured by clouds, offering a blessed cloak of darkness. They crossed the moat. They crossed the open ground. They reached the first line of Ottoman trenches. Silence. The Greek vanguard thought they had succeeded. They crept forward, yataghans drawn, ready to slit the throats of sleeping sentries. Then, a single musket shot rang out. It was the signal. Suddenly, the night evaporated. Flares and torches were lit along the entire Ottoman line. The darkness was replaced by a blinding, flickering light, and from the darkness came the thunder. Ibrahim's artillery, pre-sighted on the bridges and the open plain, opened fire simultaneously. Canister shot cans filled with musket balls that turn a cannon into a giant shotgun tore through the Greek columns. The silence was replaced by a cacophony of screaming metal and screaming men. But the Greeks did not stop. They roared, "Eleftheria, freedom," and charged. The first column hit the Ottoman lines with the force of a tsunami. These were men who had been starving for months. men who had nothing left to lose. They leaped into the trenches. The fighting was primal. No tactics, no formations, just knives, teeth, and rocks. They clawed their way through the first line, then the second. For a moment, it looked like the impossible might happen. The sheer fury of the Suliotes was pushing the Egyptians back. Then, the catastrophe happened. In the chaos of the third column, the one carrying the women and children, a shout went up, "Opiso! Opiso! Back! Back!" Historians still debate who yelled it. Some say it was a traitor. Others say it was a panic-induced hallucination. Others believe it was a Greek officer seeing the cavalry trap and trying to warn them. But the effect was devastating. The civilians, terrified by the artillery and the sudden wall of fire, heard the command to retreat. They panicked. The column broke. Thousands of women and children turned around and ran back toward the city gates. The cohesion of the exodus shattered. The spearhead was cut off from the body. The vanguard was fighting its way out, but the heart of the city was rushing back into the cage. And that is when the cavalry charged. Ibrahim unleashed his Mamelukes and Albanian horsemen. They didn't charge the soldiers. They charged the civilians. The plain between the city and the trenches became a slaughterhouse. Horses trampled women into the mud. Sabres swung in the torchlight. The wails of children rose above the roar of the cannons. It was no longer a battle. It was a hunt. Those who made it back to the city found no safety. The Ottoman infantry, sensing the rout, scrambled over the walls. The mud fence that had held for a year was finally breached. The fighting moved into the streets. It moved into the houses. It moved into the churches. This is where the legend of Missolonghi was truly written, not in the tactical success of the breakout, but in the apocalyptic violence of the fall. Inside the city, every house became a fortress. Wounded men fired from windows until they were killed. Women threw rocks from rooftops. But the end was inevitable. The flood of Ottoman soldiers was unstoppable. They pushed the defenders back, street by street, towards the centre, toward the bastion of Botsaris, toward the windmills, toward the stone houses where the immovable were waiting. Christos Kapsalis sat in the dark of the magazine. He could hear the screams getting closer. He could smell the smoke of the burning city. He checked the fuse of his torch. He looked at the faces around him, the sick, the elderly, the young mothers holding babies. They were terrified, yes, but they were also ready. The door burst open. Ottoman soldiers poured in, shouting in triumph, expecting plunder and slaves. Kapsalis didn't hesitate. He didn't give a speech. He simply lowered the torch. The explosion was tectonic. It wasn't just a boom. It was an erasure. The entire neighborhood disintegrated. The blast wave threw bodies, Greek and Turk alike, hundreds of yards into the lagoon. Kapsalis took hundreds of the enemy with him. It wasn't the only one. Across the city, as the Ottomans breached other strongpoints, the same scene played out. The Bishop Rogon Joseph, barricaded in the windmill with his flock, held out until the ammunition was gone. When the enemy broke down the doors, he set fire to the powder kegs. Boom. Another house. Boom. The city of Missolonghi committed suicide rather than surrender. The night was lit by the flashes of these massive suicides. It was a symphony of self-destruction. The sheer horror of it paused even the Ottoman soldiers. They had come to conquer a city, not to fight ghosts who blew themselves up. By dawn, the city was gone. In its place was a smoking ruin filled with corpses. Of the 3,000 soldiers who attempted the breakout, only 1,300 made it to the safety of the mountains. They were wraiths, bleeding, starving, leaving a trail of dead behind them. Of the 10,000 civilians, almost none survived. Most were killed in the plain or in the city. The survivors, mostly young women and children, were captured. They were rounded up in the ruins, bound in chains, and prepared for the slave markets of Alexandria and Constantinople. But the victory tasted like ash in Ibrahim's mouth. He walked through the smouldering ruins the next morning. He saw the piles of his own dead mixed with the Greeks. He saw the shattered remains of the powder magazines. He realized that while he had taken the geography, he had failed to take the spirit. He had promised the Sultan a swift victory. Instead, he had bought a pile of rubble at the cost of his army's soul. The Greeks had lost everything: their families, their homes, their lives. From a military standpoint, it was a total defeat. The rebellion in western Greece was crushed. The path to Athens was open. The revolution seemed to be over. But in the strange alchemy of history, the blood spilled that night was more powerful than any victory. The sound of Kapsalis's explosion didn't stop at the lagoon. It echoed across the sea. It reached the coffee houses of Paris. It reached the Parliament in London. It reached the palaces of St. Petersburg. The world had watched the Greeks fight for 5 years with a mix of admiration and skepticism. But Missolonghi changed the narrative. This wasn't just a war anymore. It was a martyrdom. The image of the starving mother charging a cannon. The image of the old man blowing himself up. These weren't just war stories. They were religious iconography for a secular age. Europe woke up. The artists, the poets, the politicians, they could no longer look away. The exodus had failed to save the people of Missolonghi, but it was about to save Greece. The dead had done what the living could not. They had shamed the great powers into action. The ashes were still warm, the smoke was still rising, and in that smoke, the shape of a new nation was beginning to form. The morning after the fall, Missolonghi was a landscape of horror. The sun rose on a city that had been disemboweled. The streets were choked with debris, broken weapons, and bodies. The smell was unbearable, a mixture of burnt gunpowder, charred wood, and death. Ibrahim Pasha, the victor, wanted to send a message that resistance was futile. He ordered the heads of the prominent defenders to be cut off. Pyramids of heads were piled near the gates, but the true grim accounting was sent to Constantinople. Sacks filled with 3,000 pairs of ears were dispatched to the Sultan as proof of victory. It was a medieval receipt for a modern war. The survivors, mostly women and children who hadn't been trampled or killed in the explosions, were gathered in the ruins. They were starving, traumatized, and now enslaved. They were marched to the ships, destined for the slave markets of Cairo and Alexandria. From a military perspective, the Greek Revolution was dead. Western Greece was pacified. The road to Athens was open. The Ottoman Empire had won. But history is rarely decided by the scoreboard of a single battle. The news of the fall of Missolonghi hit Europe like a physical blow. For years, the Greek cause had been popular among intellectuals, but governments had remained cold. They viewed the Greeks as rebels disturbing the balance of power. They didn't want to upset the Ottoman Empire. But Missolonghi changed the moral calculus. It wasn't a defeat, it was a holocaust. The stories of the starvation, the exodus, and the self-immolation of Kapsalis spread like wildfire. They were printed in newspapers in London, Paris, and Berlin. They were recited in salons. Victor Hugo wrote poems about the heads of the seraglio. Eugène Delacroix painted Greece on the ruins of Missolonghi, depicting a woman symbolizing Greece standing with open arms over a pile of rubble. It became the Guernica of the 19th century. The public outcry was deafening. Philhellenism, the love of Greek culture, transformed from a hobby for rich poets into a mass political movement. People in France and Britain demanded to know why their governments were letting Christian heroes be slaughtered by a barbaric empire. The pressure on the great powers became irresistible. The mathematics of realpolitik bowed to the mythology of martyrdom. In London, Paris, and St. Petersburg, diplomats began to move. The Treaty of London was signed in July 1827, barely a year after the fall. Britain, France, and Russia agreed to intervene. They didn't declare war, but they sent their fleets to enforce peace. This led directly to the Bay of Navarino. In October 1827, the combined fleets of the great powers sailed into the harbour of Navarino, where Ibrahim's fleet, the same fleet that had blockaded Missolonghi, was anchored. A tense standoff turned into a battle. In 4 hours, the Ottoman and Egyptian navies were annihilated. It was the decisive moment of the war, and it happened because of Missolonghi. If the city had surrendered in January, there would have been no outcry. There would have been no Delacroix painting. There would have been no public pressure. The great powers would have likely stayed home. The Greek Revolution would have ended in 1826 as a failed footnote in Ottoman history. But because they held, because they starved, because they blew themselves up rather than submit, they forced the world to act. The defenders of Missolonghi lost their lives, but they bought their nation's freedom with their blood. They proved a timeless military truth. You can defeat an army, but you cannot defeat a people who prefer death to slavery. Today, if you visit Missolonghi, you enter through the Gate of the Exodus. The city is a living monument. The Garden of Heroes holds the tombs of Botzaris, the memorial to Lord Byron, and the statues of the defenders. Every year on Palm Sunday, they reenact the Exodus, men in traditional dress, women in black, marching in silence. It is not a celebration of victory, it is a funeral procession, but it is a funeral for the victors. Ibrahim Pasha is remembered as a brutal conqueror whose ambition crumbled in the mud of a lagoon. The Sultan is remembered as the ruler of a dying empire. But the free besieged? They are eternal. They remind us that the most powerful weapon in war isn't the cannon or the bayonet or the disciplined formation. It is the human will. In the end, the logic of the empire failed. The numbers didn't add up. The 10,000 ghosts of Missolonghi stand as a permanent warning to any power that thinks it can crush the human spirit with math. They came as conquerors. They left as witnesses to a miracle, the miracle of the fence that became a grave, and the grave that became a cradle for a nation.